Imagine walking into a coffee shop to buy a new bag of beans for the machine you have at home. You order something for you to have there, and you discuss with the barista and you try to align what they have and what your preferences are. And after a brief discussion, you walk away with a drink you fancy. In my case, it would be a filter coffee made with a natural Ethiopian crop, and 2 bags to use at home. However, this situation isn't so realistic anymore. It depends where you are, but different governments have different policies. And usually these policies entail at least that going outside should be limited, only takeaway is allowed, and you should in other ways limit the amount of contact you have with other people. In turn, consumers are also anxious to go out. They may be afraid for the virus and they revert to online shopping instead. It's still very early days, but one of the effects that this pandemic seemed to have is that people have turned to online grocery shopping and other consumer goods in a more permanent way than before. So one problem with online sales that concern flavor, whether it is beer or wine or chocolate or coffee indeed, is that getting across how something tastes is difficult. We can't transfer smells and tastes over the internet. So the solution here is language, the flavor description. But this brings on new issues because many people are experiencing difficulties in trying to describe what they smell and taste. But there are nevertheless groups of experts that we can turn to for rich flavor descriptions. So talking about flavors, talking about wine experts do it all the time. So they also have a lot of experience reviewing wines online, and there are many websites where you can look up reviews of wines that also sell wines. So we'll go into these reviews later, but first we'll have a look at whether wine experts do actually convey information about the smell and flavor of wine, or whether this is just a fancy marketing trick that we all fall for, or perhaps there's another alternative that they just are some sort of poetic artist instead. If you ask a wine expert to describe wines, they certainly make the impression that they can talk about smells and flavors. So take this online wine description of a Sauvignon Blanc. It's dry citrusy aromas, pop on the nose. It's more round in feel with green fruit and herb flavors. Bell pepper and jalapeno notes show on the finish. So even though there are no specific words in English or in Dutch to describe smells, there is no smell vocabulary in our languages. This description seems very elaborate and very thorough, and maybe you even got an impression about how this wine will taste. However, if you read this, it could also be taken as some sort of uninformative poetic exercise. So this raises the question of whether wine experts are actually good at describing smells and flavors, or whether there's something else happening here. So in order to investigate this, during my PhD I did a study where I compared wine experts to novices, and I asked wine experts and novices to describe common smells like orange and cinnamon, basic tastes like sour and bitter, and also the smell and taste of 5 different wines and the smell and taste of 5 different coffees. And what I found was that wine experts are much more consistent when it comes down to describing the smell and taste of wines, but not anything else. So they're just as good as novices when they describe common smells and basic tastes. And it's important to note that it's very difficult to say that something is right or wrong when it comes down to the flavor or the smell of a wine. But if you ask different experts, you can come down to agreement. So if different experts say the same thing, you can say that they are consistent and that this flavor can actually be found in a wine, or at least that they agree on how they would describe a specific wine. So what I found was that wine experts are more consistent in their descriptions for the smell and taste of wine. And in another study, we looked in more detail at online wine descriptions, so at tasting notes, like this one. We wanted to know whether we could predict variety, origin and color from the review text alone. So we collected a corpus with over 75,000 wine reviews by 13 different authors. And then we learned the computer algorithm how the reviews were tied to each of those categories by first looking at what words often go together. In this example, that would mean that the computer learned that citrusy, pop, and green would often go together. And in the next step, the computer learned that these words are often used to describe Sauvignon Blanc. So we used reviews from 12 different authors to train the computer with. And in the next phase, we wanted to see how good the computer was for new unseen reviews from a different author. So we used reviews from a 13th author. So for example, if the computer has learned that reviews containing jalapeno most likely occur with Sauvignon Blanc, this new review would be classified as probably being Sauvignon Blanc. And the computer would be correct. But more importantly, the computer would be correct for a new and unseen author. So this would then show that not only are the reviewers consistent in their own reviews, they also describe wines consistently between different authors. So we had a few different outcomes for this study. If these words are not consistently used, the predictive power of the algorithm would be poor. If the words are consistently used, but the words themselves are not distinctive, for example, they would use red in all of the reviews, the predictive power of the algorithm would still be poor. But if authors use language consistently and distinctively, the predictions will be accurate. And this latter option turned out to be true. So we could predict color and grape variety with high accuracy compared to baseline. So the wine experts used these words consistently and distinctively. But what words did they actually use? So to find out what the words were that they used to distinctively and consistently describe those wines, we compared the frequency of all those words to a corpus of standard English words. And we filtered out the words that were used much more frequently in the corpus compared to standard English. And it turned out their vocabulary wasn't that big, so they used about 140 words over and over again, basically, and they reached consistency in that. But they also managed to describe different wines distinctively. So the 33 different grape varieties in the corpus were all distinctively described with those 146 words. So this shows that experts are being able to use sort of a limited vocabulary in a very consistent and distinctive way. We've looked at findings on wine experts, but let's look at the wine consumer side. So does having descriptions on websites help? So in a recent study by Ribeiro et al., they showed participants different online shelves with pictures of bottles, and they showed information about ratings and a description. The bottle pictures all contained information about the variety, the origin, the vintage, etc. So that's not a factor in the study. But the interesting dependent factor was the description. When participants saw a description, they were willing to pay $7 more for a wine. Just the information about the flavor made them that they were willing to pay more for a specific wine. And this study actually replicates a number of studies that consistently show that people that buy wine mainly look at the back of the bottle for information about the flavor of a wine. And similar studies have also shown that about half of the consumers actually prefer to look at the back of the bottle compared to talking to someone in the store about the flavor of a wine. So that's a very specific type of consumer probably, but they are quite frequent. Let's turn to coffee now. What about coffee? In the study I've shown you before, we also included a group of coffee experts. And we asked them also to describe common smells, common taste, and the smell and taste of wine, and the smell and taste of coffee. But different from the wine experts, we found that coffee experts were not consistent in their descriptions of coffee. Not more than novices at least. And we wanted to know why. So we also looked at the descriptions and we made word clouds to get a sense of the frequency of all the words that they used. And these were Dutch experts talking in Dutch, but it gives an idea. So when you look at the words the coffee experts used, these words are all low frequency, they're relatively unique, and what is not plotted in these words, in these word clouds, is that there are a lot of words that only one or two experts actually used. This shows that they were very specific, but it also explains why they were very little consistent. So this finding really surprised me, especially compared to the wine experts. So when I gave a talk at the Sensory Summit in Zurich earlier this year, I got the opportunity to investigate this finding more closely. And at the Sensory Summit, there were about 70 coffee professionals that participated in a tasting. And I wondered if they were successful at communicating coffees and wines to others. So I asked them to match 3 coffees in front of them to 3 coffees in front of their neighbor, just by talking about the coffees and by talking about the wines. And the results show that the coffee experts were all better at talking about coffee than they were talking about wine, although there's probably room to improve both. But what is also interesting in this study, in this finding, is that about 1/3 were Q graders, 1/3 had other formal coffee education, and the final 1/3 worked with coffee. They were all coffee professionals, but they didn't have a formal degree. Yet there was no difference between those 3 groups. So this confirms that it's not formal education that matters per se, but it's practice that matters most. So coffee experts do seem to be able to get their message across, but they use many unique words and they are not so consistent in that process. And this might actually be confusing for consumers. So let's have a look at some online descriptions from websites on coffee versus wine. And if you look at those descriptions, there are some other differences that are striking. So coffee descriptions often seem a bit staccato, so they're less rich and less structured. Take this description from a Colombian coffee, which is mentioning chocolate, red berries, and panela. Or this coffee from Peru, which is described as strawberry, cream, chocolate, and pineapple. So to a consumer, it's probably unclear what is meant by these notes. Is this what they might smell? Is this what they might taste? Is it in the cup? Is it in the bag? It's unclear. And this makes the description vague and less imaginable, probably. So it's difficult to form a flavor image in your mind for these descriptions. Wine descriptions, on the other hand, are much richer, and they often follow a clear structure. So first, wine experts would describe the color, the smell, the flavor and the taste, the mouthfeel, and they will probably finish with the aftertaste. Not in all cases, but sometimes. So like this blend, the second description that I shown on the screen, it has all different kinds of berries, but it's also really explicitly explained where those flavors might be experienced. Is it on the nose? Is it on the palate? Is it in the aftertaste? And they really guide the reader in what they can experience where. So this makes the description more imaginable for wines. And there's always this really clear structure. Start with smell, then flavor and taste, then mouthfeel, sometimes aftertaste. So let's return to our online coffee shop. How can we match what consumers want to what experts provide? Coffee professionals are able to talk about the flavor of coffee, which is what consumers want. But like in wine, consumers seem to want descriptions about flavors that they understand and that they can imagine. With these descriptions, they can base their choice on and they can hone in their preferences. So what flavors often occur with what kind of coffee beans. And this is also supported by consumer studies done by the SCA, underscoring consumers want attributes to base their decision on and they want to be educated about flavor. But there still seems to be a mismatch between what coffee descriptions currently are and what consumers seem to expect. Just before going into my promised suggestions, I would like to highlight this fairly recent development. The Coffee Tasters Flavor Wheel. That is what you see here. So this is developed to provide a tool to consistently describe the flavors in coffee, to be able to track the quality and consistency over time of different coffee lots. But it also provides an interesting tool to develop and train coffee flavor language. So it might be good to limit descriptions to the flavors on this wheel, both to hone one's own vocabulary, become more familiar with those words on the wheel, but also to make consumers familiar with a somewhat limited vocabulary for flavors. Because flavors can be super rich, and that may be distracting for consumers. This is where my suggestions come in. So based on what I know about wine. Compared superficially, at least, to wine descriptions, coffee flavor descriptions seem less rich in every flavor modality, and they seem less structured. So my suggestion would be to structure the descriptions. The findings on wine experts and also on coffee experts actually in Zurich show that practice will improve descriptions, but it's not necessarily education that matters. And I would also not overdo the specificness of the descriptions. So don't use very specific words, but take the flavor wheel as a starting point and base your descriptions on that. So find a balance between distinctiveness, being unique, what makes the coffee unique, and also consistency. So what makes this coffee comparable to other coffees of the same type, and that makes the description recognizable for consumers. There are a lot of open questions. So does a structured way to write reviews help? We don't really know. It may help to focus on the diversity of flavor found in coffee. It may help consumers to focus on what they expect. It may be more imaginable to separate the different senses into different in your description. And this could help consumers guide them towards what they want. But we don't know whether the structured reviews are more consistent than free reviews. And we don't know whether consumers benefit from structured reviews either. It does seem so in wine. So in the end, the online communicative channel for flavor is language. And to finish my talk, I hope that I've persuaded you that descriptions of coffee should contain rich and structured flavor descriptions. Education is not the key factor to be able to describe flavors, experiences. And by educating consumers, using a limited vocabulary, they can become familiar with, if used in a consistent way, to the different types of coffee and can be introduced to other types of coffee. So this would allow them to learn to understand why something tastes like it does and why something is worth what it is. And this would make, in the end, coffee better. So this was my presentation. And to answer one of the open questions, I've asked you to describe 2 coffees just before the session was aired. One of the coffees you described just like you would normally, and for the other one, I gave you a structure to stick to. And right now, I hope I've analyzed the results in the meantime while you were watching me. And let's look at some word clouds to see how consistent those different descriptions were. Thank you.